My phone rang at exactly 11:20 p.m. The moment I answered, I didn't hear my daughter's voice. I heard someone pounding on a door hard enough to shake the hinges. Then came Laura's whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Dad, please don't let him find me." Every instinct I had developed over 31 years as a U.S. postal inspector came rushing back before I even asked where she was. "I'm locked inside the women's restroom at the Shell station on Highway 16, she whispered between uneven breaths. "Ethan is outside. He keeps saying he just wants to talk." Then I heard his voice through the phone. Calm, controlled, almost friendly. "Laura," he called from the other side of the door. "You can't stay in there forever. Let's go home and forget this happened." He wasn't shouting. That was the part that frightened me most. Men who lose control usually make noise. Men who plan to keep control rarely do. "Listen to me," I said as I grabbed my truck keys. "Don't unlock that door for anyone except a police officer or me. Keep your phone with you. Don't argue with him. Just keep breathing." I was already backing out of the driveway before the call ended. Rain had started falling hard enough to blur the windshield, but I barely noticed. Every mile reminded me of another night years earlier when I had raced toward danger instead of away from it. The only difference was that this time I wasn't trying to protect evidence. I was trying to protect my daughter. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the gas station. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a silver SUV parked beside the entrance. Ethan Brooks leaned casually against it with both hands in his pockets, looking more like a patient husband than a desperate man. When he saw my truck, he smiled, as though he had been expecting me. "Mr. Donovan," he said politely, "I'm glad you're here. Laura's upset. I think she's misunderstood a few things." I didn't answer. I walked straight past him and knocked twice on the restroom door. "Laura, it's Dad." The lock clicked almost instantly. When she stepped outside, I barely recognized her. Her mascara had run down both cheeks. One sleeve of her jacket was torn, and her hands shook so violently she struggled to hold her phone. She didn't even look at Ethan. She walked directly toward me and grabbed my arm with both hands like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. Ethan sighed dramatically. "See what I mean?" he said. "She's been under a lot of stress lately." I looked at him for the first time. "Did you touch her?" His smile never moved. "I'd never hurt my wife. It wasn't an answer. It was a performance." I had interviewed hundreds of suspects who responded that way. They answered the accusation they wished had been asked, instead of the one standing directly in front of them. I helped Laura into my truck without another word. Ethan took 2 slow steps forward before stopping. "Mr. Donovan," he called, "whatever she's telling you tonight, remember, there's always another side to every story." I closed the passenger door and looked at him through the rain. "You're right," I said calmly. "There always is." It was the only sentence I spoke before driving away. Laura remained silent for nearly 10 miles. Then, without warning, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I glanced at her. "For what?" She stared out the window. "For not believing you when you said something about him never felt right." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel but kept my voice steady. "You're safe now. That's all that matters tonight." She slowly shook her head. "No. You don't understand." She reached into her purse and handed me her phone. A new message had arrived less than 2 minutes after we left the gas station. There were only 8 words on the screen. "You just destroyed your family. You'll regret this." I read the message once, handed the phone back, and kept driving. Threats had never impressed me. What interested me was timing. Ethan hadn't begged Laura to come back. He hadn't apologized. His first response after losing control was to threaten consequences. That told me something far more important than anger ever could. This wasn't a marriage breaking apart. It was a man watching his plan begin to fail. When we finally reached my house, Laura asked the question every frightened child asks, no matter how old they become. "Do you think he'll come here?" I looked at the porch light Margaret had insisted we leave on every night, even after she passed away. Then I looked back at my daughter. "I don't know if he will," I answered honestly. "But if he does." I unlocked the front door, stepped aside so Laura could enter first, and quietly made myself one promise. This would be the last night Ethan Brooks ever decided where my daughter was allowed to feel safe. Neither of us slept very much that night. Laura insisted she was exhausted, but every sound outside the house pulled her eyes toward the windows before she even realized she was doing it. Years of fear had trained her body long before her mind admitted what was happening. At 6 the next morning, I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence people need before they finally tell the truth. I placed a yellow legal pad on the table and slid a pen toward her. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. "We're not writing a police report," I said quietly. "We're writing your memory before someone convinces you it never happened." She stared at the paper for several seconds before the first sentence appeared. "The first time he checked my phone, he said it was because he worried about my safety. 20 minutes later, another sentence followed. He slowly convinced me my friends were using me, then another. He always apologized, after making me cry. By the end of an hour, the page was full. None of the incidents seemed shocking on their own. Ethan never started with threats. He started with concern. He offered to manage their finances because Laura was too stressed. He wanted her phone password because married couples shouldn't have secrets. He insisted on driving her to work because traffic made him nervous. Every act sounded caring when viewed alone. Together, they formed something I had investigated dozens of times during my career. Isolation disguised as love, control disguised as protection, dependence disguised as commitment. Laura looked up from the notebook with tears forming in her eyes. "How did I not see it?" she whispered. I shook my head. "Because he didn't build a prison in one day. He built it one reasonable request at a time." She lowered her eyes again. "He always made me think everything was my fault. If he got angry, it was because I wasn't listening. If he checked my phone, it was because I gave him reasons to worry. If he followed me after work." Her voice broke before she could finish. "He said it was because he loved me." I reached across the table and closed the notebook. "Laura, people who love you don't need to monitor you." She covered her face with both hands and cried quietly. I didn't interrupt her. Survivors of psychological abuse rarely need advice first. They need permission to stop pretending they were responsible for someone else's choices. Nearly an hour later, my landline rang. Almost nobody called that number anymore. I answered, but the line went dead the moment I spoke. No breathing, no background noise, just silence. 5 minutes later, my cell phone vibrated with a blocked number. Again, nobody spoke. They simply stayed connected long enough for me to know someone was listening before disconnecting. Laura looked at me nervously. "It's him, isn't it?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the front window. Across the street, a gray sedan was parked beside the curb. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windshield, but I noticed something else. The engine was still running. It remained there for almost 3 minutes before slowly pulling away, without ever stopping at another house. I wrote down the license plate from memory before closing the curtains. Laura watched me carefully. "You think he's watching us?" I looked back at her. "No." I picked up my notebook and wrote the exact time beside the plate number. "I think he wants us to know he's watching." There was a difference, and people like Ethan depended on victims never understanding it. Surveillance wasn't only about gathering information. It was about creating the feeling that escape was impossible. Just before noon, Laura's phone vibrated once more. This time it wasn't a text, it was a photograph. Someone had taken a picture of the elementary school where she worked as a speech therapist. The image had clearly been taken that morning. There were children walking toward the entrance, teachers greeting parents, and in the bottom corner of the frame was Laura's reserved parking space. Beneath the photo were only 4 words. "I'll always find you." Laura's hands began shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. I looked at the picture for several long seconds before locking the screen. Then I walked into my study, opened the closet where I had stored a weathered metal case after retirement, and carried it back to the dining table. Laura looked at it curiously as I placed it in front of her. Inside were my old field notebooks, a digital camera, evidence envelopes, and the habits I had never truly retired from. I looked at my daughter and spoke the words I never imagined I would have to say to her. "Laura, starting today, we're not just protecting you anymore." I opened the first empty notebook and wrote Ethan Brooks across the top of the page. Starting today, we're building a case. The biggest mistake frightened people make is believing danger disappears simply because they lock the front door. By sunrise the next morning, I had already accepted that Ethan wasn't chasing Laura anymore. He was studying us. That meant every decision I made from that moment forward had to serve two purposes: protect my daughter today and preserve evidence for tomorrow. After breakfast, I called the first person I trusted without needing to explain why. Henry Walker answered on the second ring. "You only call this early when something's wrong," he said. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I need cameras before sunset." He didn't ask another question. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. While waiting, I walked around the property with a notebook, treating my own home the way I once examined crime scenes. The front porch had only one blind spot. The side gate couldn't be seen from the driveway. The backyard fence backed onto a narrow service road where a car could stop unnoticed for several minutes. Ethan hadn't chosen Laura by accident. Men obsessed with control usually studied environments as carefully as they studied people. Henry arrived carrying 2 ladders, a toolbox, and 6 high-definition security cameras he had taken from his garage. By noon, we had covered every entrance, every window facing the street, and every corner of the yard. Henry looked at the final camera feed on my laptop and whistled softly. "If a squirrel crosses your lawn tonight, you'll know its middle name." I smiled for the first time in days. I'm not interested in squirrels. Before leaving, Henry grew serious. "Frank, are you expecting this guy to come here?" I looked toward the front gate. "I'm expecting him to believe he can." He nodded once without asking anything else. Around 3 that afternoon, Susan Miller knocked gently on the door, carrying a casserole she clearly hadn't cooked for the food. Susan had spent 26 years answering 911 calls before retiring. She recognized fear long before most people admitted it existed. Laura thanked her for stopping by, but Susan's attention remained fixed on the security monitor sitting on my desk. "You're documenting everything," she observed. "I'm documenting patterns," I corrected. Susan smiled knowingly. "Good, because patterns convince judges, stories don't." Before she left, she handed Laura a small notebook. "Write down every text, every phone call, every place you think you saw him. Don't trust your memory 6 months from now. Trust today's notes." Laura held the notebook against her chest like it weighed far more than paper ever could. As evening settled over the neighborhood, nothing happened. No cars slowed in front of the house. No strange phone calls arrived. Laura even managed to laugh once while we watched an old baseball game together. I almost allowed myself to believe Ethan had backed away. Experience quickly reminded me how dangerous hope can become when it replaces caution. At 2:14 the following morning, my phone vibrated with the first motion alert from camera 3, covering the side yard. I opened the live feed expecting to see a stray cat. Instead, a hooded figure walked calmly through my garden without looking toward the house even once. Whoever it was knew exactly where every camera couldn't quite capture a face. The figure stopped beside the front porch, bent down for only a few seconds, then disappeared into the darkness before the second camera could lock focus. By the time I reached the front door, the yard was empty. There were no footprints on the wet grass and no vehicles on the street. At first, I thought the person had left nothing behind. Then my flashlight settled on something lying neatly in the center of the welcome mat. It was a silver necklace with a tiny graduation cap charm hanging from it. Laura froze the instant she saw it. Her hand flew to her neck out of instinct, even though she hadn't worn that necklace for nearly a year. "I lost this months ago," she whispered. I looked everywhere. I crouched beside the necklace without touching it. The chain had been deliberately snapped in half. The charm was scratched deeply across the front, as though someone had dragged a knife across it more than once. Most people would have seen a broken piece of jewelry. I saw a message. Ethan wasn't trying to return something Laura had lost. He was proving he had taken it long before she realized it was missing. I photographed the necklace exactly where it had been left, sealed it inside an evidence bag from the metal case in my study, and wrote down the time to the second. Laura stood silently beside me, staring at the empty porch. "How long has he been planning this?" she asked. I looked at the evidence bag in my hand before answering. long enough to make one mistake. She frowned. What mistake? I locked the bag inside the fireproof cabinet and switched the security footage back to the moment the hooded figure entered our yard. Then I paused the video on a single frame. The face was hidden. The license plate was invisible, but the person's left hand wasn't. A heavy silver college championship ring reflected the porch light for less than half a second. I had seen Ethan wear that ring every Christmas dinner for the last 3 years. And now, for the first time since Laura came home, I finally had something that belonged in court, instead of just in a conversation. The broken necklace told me something I hadn't wanted to believe. Ethan wasn't improvising. He had been collecting opportunities long before Laura ever realized she needed to escape him. Most investigations fail because people become obsessed with proving what happened yesterday, instead of asking what happened years earlier. If Ethan had done this once, chances were he had practiced the same pattern before meeting my daughter. After Laura left for an appointment with her supervisor that morning, I drove to the county courthouse carrying nothing more than my notebook and the name Ethan Brooks. Public records rarely tell complete stories, but they almost always reveal where to keep looking. Within an hour, I found exactly one document that didn't fit the image Ethan had spent years building. 4 years earlier, a woman named Rachel Bennett had filed for a temporary protective order against him. The petition had been withdrawn less than 2 weeks later, leaving almost no public explanation. Most people would have dismissed it as an ugly breakup. I didn't. Withdrawn petitions often interested me more than successful ones, because fear has a way of making victims disappear before justice has the chance to arrive. I copied the case number, wrote down Rachel's address from an old voter registration file, and drove across town without calling first. When she opened the front door, I immediately recognized the expression on her face. It wasn't surprise. It was caution practiced over many years. Before she could ask who I was, I introduced myself and told her one sentence I had rehearsed all morning. I'm not here to reopen your past. I'm here because I think the man who hurt you is hurting my daughter. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She looked past me toward the street, as though checking whether someone had followed me. Only then did she step aside and quietly say, "You'd better come in." Her house was modest, organized, and unusually quiet. There were books everywhere, but almost no photographs. People who survive controlling relationships often remove reminders long before they remove the memories themselves. Rachel poured 2 cups of coffee, sat across from me, and waited. I placed the broken necklace on the table inside the evidence bag without saying a word. The moment she saw Ethan's name written on my notebook, the color drained from her face. "He's married now?" she asked softly. I nodded. "To my daughter." Rachel closed her eyes for several seconds before whispering something that made my stomach tighten. "Then he's farther along this time." She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. Over the next hour, she described a relationship so familiar, it felt like Laura was telling the story all over again. Ethan had never started with anger. He started with admiration. He remembered birthdays, brought flowers to her workplace, and made everyone believe she had found the perfect man. Then came the small requests. "Share your location because I worry. Let me organize your finances because you're too busy. Stop spending time with that friend because she doesn't respect our relationship." Every request sounded reasonable until saying no became impossible. Rachel looked down at her coffee cup before continuing. "The first time I tried to leave, he didn't threaten me. He cried. The second time, he showed up everywhere I went. The third time, she stopped speaking altogether. I didn't interrupt. Silence often tells the hardest part of a story. After nearly a minute, she reached into a drawer beside the table and removed a faded envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of dozens of text messages. None of them contained obvious threats. Instead, they were filled with sentences like, "I'm just making sure you're safe. I know what's best for you. And you'll realize I'm the only person who truly loves you." Read separately, they sounded almost affectionate. Read together, they formed a blueprint for psychological control. Rachel handed me one final sheet of paper. It was a handwritten timeline she had created years earlier for the attorney who encouraged her to seek the protective order. Every incident was dated. every escalation documented. I stared at one particular entry. Followed me to work after I stopped answering his calls. It matched Laura's experience almost word for word. Rachel noticed where my eyes had stopped. He doesn't invent new ways to control people, she said quietly. He perfects the old ones. Before I left, I asked the question that had been bothering me since reading the courthouse records. Why did you withdraw the protective order? Rachel smiled sadly. Because by then he'd already convinced me nobody would believe me if I kept fighting. She walked me to the front door, then stopped me just before I stepped outside. Mr. Donovan, she said, your daughter still has a chance I never had. I turned back. Why? Rachel looked directly into my eyes. Because this time, Ethan picked the wrong father. I left Rachel's house carrying far more than a witness statement. I was carrying confirmation that Laura's story wasn't unique. Ethan hadn't simply become obsessed with my daughter. He had refined the same pattern over years, changing only the victim's name. During my drive home, I stopped replaying individual incidents in my mind and started arranging them the way investigators arrange evidence, by sequence instead of emotion. First came charm, then isolation, then dependence, then surveillance. Finally, fear disguised as concern. Every stage led naturally to the next, until the victim no longer noticed she was surrendering pieces of her own life. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't asking whether Ethan would escalate. I was asking, how soon? Laura was sitting on the back porch, wrapped in one of Margaret's old blankets, staring into the garden without really seeing it. She looked up as I approached and immediately recognized the expression on my face. You found someone else, didn't you? She asked. I nodded once and handed her Rachel's timeline. Laura read silently for several minutes. Halfway down the page, her breathing became noticeably slower. When she finished, she didn't cry. She simply whispered, I thought every one of those things only happened to me. I sat beside her. That's exactly what he wanted you to believe. She looked toward the empty yard. Do you think he ever loved either of us? I took longer to answer than she expected. I think he loved being necessary. That's not the same thing. She folded the timeline carefully and handed it back without another word. Around 4 that afternoon, Susan Miller stopped by after finishing errands. She listened quietly as I explained what Rachel had shared, then asked a question neither Laura nor I had considered. Has anyone checked whether Ethan's behavior changed after Laura left him? I frowned. What do you mean? Susan leaned forward. People who lose control don't always chase the person who escaped. Sometimes they start building pressure somewhere else. That sentence stayed with me long after she left. Instead of reviewing the security cameras again, I opened Laura's phone records with her permission. Most of Ethan's recent messages had been directed at her, but beginning the day after she came home, something shifted. The messages became less frequent. The phone calls stopped altogether. At first glance, it looked as though he was finally backing away. Then I noticed something far more interesting. While his communication with Laura decreased, activity around everyone connected to her increased dramatically. Henry received 2 anonymous calls asking whether Laura had returned home. Susan found someone photographing her mailbox while walking her dog. Even Dr. Melissa Grant, Laura's supervisor, left a voicemail saying a well-dressed man had visited the clinic, asking whether Laura had resigned permanently because her family was worried about her emotional stability. Ethan wasn't searching for Laura anymore. He was quietly measuring every person standing between him and Laura. That evening, I drove to the clinic without telling Laura. Dr. Grant invited me into her office and immediately handed me a visitor log. Ethan had signed his real name. He hadn't hidden behind a false identity or invented an excuse to enter the building. Instead, he had presented himself as a deeply concerned husband, hoping to help his struggling wife. He was incredibly convincing, Dr. Grant admitted. If Laura hadn't warned us beforehand, I probably would have believed every word he said. She then opened the clinic's security footage. There was Ethan, smiling politely at the receptionist, shaking hands with staff members, even thanking everyone for caring about Laura. Anyone watching without context would have described him as compassionate. Then Dr. Grant froze the video just before he left the building. Ethan stopped beside the staff directory mounted on the wall. His eyes moved slowly across every employee name before taking out his phone. "Can you zoom in?" I asked. She enlarged the image. There was no doubt about what he was doing. He was photographing the staff list. Every therapist, every administrator, every extension number, every name belonging to people Laura trusted. "Doctor." Grant looked at me nervously. "Why would he need that?" I answered without taking my eyes off the screen. "Because he's already planning his next conversation." On the drive home, I finally understood what Rachel had tried to tell me. Ethan never attacked directly when he was losing. He expanded the battlefield until the victim felt guilty for everyone else's suffering. He wanted Laura to believe her friends, co-workers, neighbors, and even her own father were becoming targets simply because she refused to return. Fear was no longer his objective. Isolation was. When I arrived home, Laura met me at the door. Before she could ask what I'd learned, my phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number containing only a single photograph. The image showed my front porch taken less than a minute earlier. The porch light was on. My truck was in the driveway. Laura's car was parked beside it. At the bottom of the picture were 6 words: "Nice family reunion. It won't last." I looked through the living room window toward the dark street outside, but saw nothing. Whoever had taken the photograph was already gone. I locked the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and made a decision I had been avoiding since Laura first arrived at my door. Ethan Brooks wasn't going to stop, because we hid from him. The only way to end this was to let him believe he still had one final move left to make. The easiest trap to escape is the one your enemy knows exists. The hardest trap is the one that looks exactly like an opportunity. The morning after Ethan sent the photograph of my front porch, I drove to the sheriff's office carrying 2 folders. One contained every photograph, message, camera recording, and written timeline Laura and I had collected. The other was completely empty. Lieutenant Marcus Hale looked through the evidence without interrupting. When he finished, he closed the last folder and leaned back in his chair. "You already have enough for us to document a pattern," he said. "But you don't yet have enough for the strongest criminal charges." I nodded. "Because he hasn't crossed the last line." Marcus looked directly at me. "No, because he's been careful not to." That answer confirmed what I already suspected. Ethan wasn't reckless. Every threatening message stopped just short of being an explicit threat. Every appearance near the house could still be explained away. Every conversation had been designed to sound reasonable if someone only heard one side. Men like Ethan didn't rely on luck. They relied on plausible deniability. I slid the empty folder across the desk. "Then let's give him the chance to make a mistake." Marcus remained silent for several seconds before a slight smile crossed his face. "Tell me what you're thinking." I explained my plan in less than 5 minutes. No fake evidence, no provocation, no tricks that would cross a legal line. We would simply stop hiding. Laura would return to work on Monday. Her schedule would be exactly the same as before. My truck would remain in the driveway every night. The porch light would stay on. The cameras would continue recording. Most importantly, nobody would contact Ethan. If he truly believed he was losing control, he would create his own opportunity. Marcus nodded slowly. "He's expecting resistance. He's not expecting confidence." By Sunday afternoon, everything was in place. Henry upgraded 2 of the exterior cameras with higher resolution lenses, capable of capturing license plates from nearly 200 feet away. Susan agreed to keep a written log of every unfamiliar vehicle entering the neighborhood. Dr. Melissa Grant quietly informed clinic staff never to speak with Ethan again without another employee present. Nobody exaggerated the danger. Nobody panicked. We simply made sure every future decision left a trail. Laura was the only person who struggled with the plan. Sunday night, she stood in the kitchen staring at the car keys in her hand. "What if he follows me again?" she asked. I walked over and placed a small key fob beside them. "Press this once and every camera around the house automatically saves the previous 5 minutes." She looked confused. "Why would I need that if I'm leaving?" "Because habits matter. From now on, every unusual moment gets preserved before anyone can erase it." She smiled faintly. "You really never retired, did you?" I smiled back. Only from collecting a paycheck. Monday morning arrived colder than usual. I watched Laura drive away from the front window until her car disappeared around the corner. Then I waited. Nothing happened for almost 6 hours. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated with a motion alert from camera 2 overlooking the driveway. A black sedan rolled slowly past the house, continued to the end of the street, turned around, and passed again, even more slowly. The license plate was perfectly visible. The driver wasn't. 30 minutes later, the same car returned. This time it stopped across the street for exactly 43 seconds before leaving again. I didn't call anyone. I simply logged the times. At 5:18 p.m., Laura called. "He's here," she whispered. I immediately opened the live access to the clinic's parking lot cameras that Dr. Grant had agreed to share with law enforcement if necessary. Ethan wasn't standing near Laura's car. He was standing near the employee entrance, holding a bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers he had brought to our house, the day he asked for my blessing to marry my daughter. Anyone walking past would have seen a devoted husband trying to save his marriage. Then the clinic's front doors opened. Ethan took one step forward, expecting Laura to walk outside alone. Instead, she emerged beside Dr. Grant and 2 other staff members. Ethan's smile remained perfectly in place, but his eyes changed instantly. He hadn't expected witnesses. He offered Laura the flowers. She never reached for them. "Please leave," she said calmly. "I'm not discussing anything with you." Ethan lowered his voice just enough that the others couldn't hear every word. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be," Laura repeated herself. "Please leave." For nearly 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then Ethan gently placed the bouquet on the hood of Laura's car and walked back toward his sedan. It looked peaceful, civil, almost respectful. But just before opening his door, he glanced toward one of the security cameras mounted above the employee entrance. Then he smiled directly into the lens. Not a friendly smile. A deliberate one. The smile of a man who wanted whoever watched the footage to know he had seen the camera and didn't care. 10 minutes later, Marcus Hale called me before I had the chance to call him. "Frank," he said quietly, "don't leave your house tonight." My grip tightened around the phone. "Why?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of calm. "Because 20 minutes after Ethan left the clinic, someone broke into his own apartment." I arrived at the sheriff's office 20 minutes later, carrying the same notebook that had been sitting beside my bed every night since Laura came home. Marcus was waiting for me in a small interview room. He closed the door, placed a stack of photographs on the table, and pushed them toward me without saying a word. Ethan's apartment had been ransacked. Drawers had been pulled out. A television lay shattered across the living room floor. Several framed photographs had been smashed, and a kitchen chair had been overturned as if someone had searched the apartment in a hurry. At first glance, it looked exactly like a burglary. Then Marcus turned over the final photograph. Spray painted across one wall were 6 words: "Leave Laura alone or you're next." He watched my face carefully. "You understand why I needed to talk to you before this becomes public?" I nodded. "Because someone wants this to look personal." Marcus folded his arms. "Ethan claims you've been threatening him for days." That accusation didn't surprise me. The timing did. Ethan had visited Laura at the clinic in broad daylight, carefully making himself appear calm and reasonable. Less than half an hour later, his own apartment was destroyed. If investigators rushed to conclusions, the story practically wrote itself. Protective father loses his temper and retaliates. It was neat. Emotional. Believable. Exactly the kind of narrative Ethan preferred. Marcus slid another document across the table. He also provided screenshots. They appeared to show messages sent from an anonymous number, warning Ethan to stay away from Laura. One message read, "Next time, I won't just break your furniture." Another ended with, "A father will do anything for his daughter." I looked at them for less than 10 seconds before sliding the pages back. "They're fake." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That was quick." I tapped the second screenshot. "The timestamps don't match the cellular records we already subpoenaed yesterday. Whoever created these forgot that phone providers keep independent logs." Marcus smiled slightly but didn't comment. Instead, he reached into a folder and removed a USB drive. There's something else. The drive contained security footage from Ethan's apartment building. At 6:41 p.m., a hooded figure entered through the rear stairwell carrying a backpack. At 7:03 p.m., the same person left using the front entrance. The face was hidden every second. Height and build matched almost anyone. It was professionally done. Too professionally. Notice anything? Marcus asked. I replayed the footage 3 times before stopping at a single frame. The backpack. Marcus nodded. Go on. Whoever staged this wanted investigators to believe they carried tools inside. But when they left, the backpack hangs exactly the same way. Same shape, same weight. If someone had stolen electronics or searched for documents, the bag would sit differently. Marcus leaned back. You're the first person who's noticed that. Because whoever walked in wasn't there to steal anything, I answered quietly. They were there to create a crime scene. Marcus opened another file. Crime scene says nothing of value is actually missing. That confirmed it. Ethan hadn't become the victim of revenge. He had become the director of his own performance. The problem for him was that staged scenes almost always contain details real victims never think about. I asked one question. Who called 911? Marcus looked down at his notes. Ethan. Exactly 43 seconds after entering the apartment. I almost laughed. 43 seconds? Marcus nodded. Too fast? Much too fast. I pointed toward the photographs. He supposedly discovered his apartment destroyed, processed the damage, checked for intruders, noticed threatening graffiti, called emergency services, and stayed calm enough to describe everything in 43 seconds. Marcus didn't say anything for nearly half a minute. Finally, he stood up and walked to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. Without looking at me, he said, Forensics found something this morning. He wrote 2 words. Fresh paint. The graffiti was still wet when deputies arrived. Then he wrote 2 more. No forced entry. Finally, a 3rd line. Only 1 set of prints. I looked at the board and felt the entire puzzle lock into place. Ethan hadn't overlooked evidence. He had overlooked sequence. He expected everyone to focus on the destruction, not on the order in which it must have happened. Marcus turned back toward me. We're applying for a warrant to examine every device he owns. Before I could answer, his office phone rang. He listened for less than a minute before his expression changed completely. When he hung up, he looked directly at me. Frank, you're not going to believe this. Try me. Marcus picked up the evidence bag lying on his desk. Inside was the bouquet of white lilies Ethan had left on Laura's car outside the clinic. The crime lab just found microscopic traces of the exact same spray paint used on the wall of Ethan's apartment, hidden underneath the ribbon wrapped around these flowers. Neither of us spoke. Ethan had planned every step with extraordinary care. But somewhere between leaving the clinic and staging his own attack, he had forgotten the oldest rule every investigator learns. The smallest detail is often the one no criminal ever thinks to clean. By Tuesday morning, Ethan had stopped pretending this was about saving his marriage. The warrant Marcus requested had been approved before sunrise, but he deliberately kept that information confidential. When people believe they're still ahead, he told me over the phone, they usually give us one more mistake. He was right. At 9:12 that morning, Dr. Melissa Grant called to say Ethan had returned to the clinic. This time he wasn't asking polite questions. He was demanding Laura come outside, because he had proof everyone had been lying about him. Marcus instructed every responding deputy to remain out of sight unless the situation became dangerous. He wanted to see what Ethan believed he could accomplish when he thought nobody was watching. Laura looked at me before leaving the house. Do I really have to go to work today? She asked quietly. I understood the fear behind the question, but fear couldn't become the rest of her life. You don't have to face him, I answered, but you do deserve your life back. She took a slow breath, nodded once, and drove away. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a secure link from Marcus. The clinic had agreed to let us monitor the exterior security cameras in real time. Ethan was already standing near the employee entrance, wearing a navy suit, holding a thick folder under one arm. Anyone walking past would have mistaken him for an attorney or a concerned husband. when Laura stepped outside accompanied by Dr. Grant. Ethan immediately opened the folder and spread dozens of printed screenshots across the hood of his car. "Look at what your father has been doing," he said loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "He's been stalking me. He's been threatening me. He's manipulating you." Laura didn't move closer. She stayed exactly where she was. "I'm asking you one last time," she said calmly. "Please leave." Ethan ignored her and began holding up individual pages toward the small crowd gathering near the entrance. Most of them were the same fabricated messages Marcus had already shown me the day before. Ethan's mistake wasn't bringing fake evidence. His mistake was believing nobody else already knew it was fake. At that exact moment, another car pulled into the parking lot. Rachel Bennett stepped out, carrying a folder of her own. Ethan froze the instant he recognized her. For the first time since this nightmare began, the confidence disappeared from his face without warning. Rachel walked directly toward the group and spoke before Ethan had the chance. "Those aren't the first documents he's fabricated," she said clearly. "He tried almost the same thing with me 4 years ago." Several clinic employees exchanged confused looks. Ethan recovered quickly. "She's unstable," he snapped. "That's why the court dismissed her case." Rachel calmly handed Dr. Grant certified copies of the withdrawn petition, together with her original written statement, dated years before Laura had ever met Ethan. "The court didn't dismiss it," she replied. "I withdrew it because I was afraid." The parking lot fell completely silent. Ethan looked from Rachel to Laura, then back again, desperately searching for someone who still believed him. Before he could speak, Marcus Hale's unmarked SUV entered the lot from the opposite side. 2 additional sheriff's vehicles quietly blocked the exits. Ethan immediately noticed them. Instead of panicking, he smiled. "Good," he said loudly. "Now everyone will finally hear the truth." Marcus walked toward him carrying a thin evidence folder. "We already have," he answered. He removed several photographs showing the fresh spray paint recovered from Ethan's apartment, followed by laboratory reports matching microscopic particles found beneath the ribbon wrapped around the bouquet Ethan had left on Laura's car. Then came the cellular records contradicting Ethan's fabricated screenshots, followed by surveillance stills placing him alone near his apartment minutes before calling 911. Ethan stopped smiling. "Those don't prove anything," he replied, though his voice had lost the confidence it carried only seconds earlier. Marcus nodded. "You're right. By themselves, they don't." He then produced the final document, a search inventory from Ethan's home office, executed less than 2 hours earlier under warrant. Among the items recovered were unused sheets of the same vinyl lettering used to create the threatening messages, identical spray paint cans matching the laboratory analysis, multiple prepaid phones, and a laptop containing draft versions of the anonymous texts, long before they had ever been sent. Marcus closed the folder. "That proves quite a bit." Ethan took one slow step backward before suddenly reaching for the documents scattered across the hood of his car. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to grab the fake evidence before deputies could seize it. The movement lasted less than a second. Deputy officers closed the distance immediately. "Don't!" Marcus ordered. Ethan ignored him, clutching the papers against his chest. Marcus nodded once. "Ethan Brooks, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, filing a false police report, witness intimidation, stalking, and harassment." The words seemed to echo across the parking lot. Ethan looked directly at Laura as deputies secured his hands behind his back. "Tell them," he pleaded. "Tell them I only did all of this because I love you." Laura stared at him for several long seconds. Then, with a calmness I hadn't seen in months, she answered quietly, "No, Ethan. You did all of this because you couldn't stand losing control." There was nothing left for him to say. As deputies guided him toward the patrol vehicle, several clinic employees lowered their phones. None of them had realized they had been recording the entire confrontation from the moment Ethan began waving his fabricated evidence in the air. Marcus looked at me briefly before the patrol car door closed. "Frank," he said, "today wasn't the end." I frowned. "Then what was it?" He glanced toward the courthouse, visible across town. "Today was the day we finally stopped arguing about what happened." He paused, before adding, "Now we get to prove it in court." 3 months later, I walked into the county courthouse with the same notebook that had been sitting beside my bed since the night Laura arrived at my door. The pages were worn, the corners folded, and several entries had been highlighted so many times the ink had started to bleed through the paper. It wasn't just a notebook anymore. It was a timeline proving that truth becomes much harder to deny when someone has the patience to record it one day at a time. Ethan entered the courtroom a few minutes later wearing an expensive gray suit that looked almost identical to the one he had worn the first day I met him. If someone had never heard this case before, they would have seen a successful professional whose life had suddenly fallen apart. That had always been Ethan's greatest talent. He understood appearances better than most people understood facts. His attorney opened aggressively, arguing that Ethan had been the real victim from the beginning. Laura had supposedly suffered from emotional instability. I had manipulated her into leaving the marriage. Rachel had returned only because she held a personal grudge, and every action Ethan took had been nothing more than an attempt to reconcile with his wife. It was a carefully constructed story. The problem was that stories collapse when they collide with timelines. The prosecutor never raised his voice. He simply began placing evidence on the screen in chronological order. Laura's handwritten notes created before any criminal investigation had started. Rachel's timeline written 4 years before Laura had even met Ethan. The clinic visitor log, showing Ethan repeatedly appearing at Laura's workplace. Security footage from my home. The broken necklace left on my porch. The anonymous photographs. The laboratory reports matching the spray paint hidden beneath the ribbon of the flower bouquet. Every document stood alone, but together they revealed something far more powerful than individual incidents. They revealed a pattern. When Rachel testified, the courtroom became unusually quiet. She didn't speak with anger or bitterness. She described small moments instead. The first time Ethan insisted on knowing where she was every hour. The first time he convinced her to stop visiting her sister because family created unnecessary drama. The first time she apologized for something she hadn't done, simply to avoid another exhausting argument. As she spoke, I noticed several jurors writing notes before she even finished each answer. They weren't reacting to dramatic accusations. They were recognizing repetition. Laura testified next. She never called Ethan evil. She never exaggerated. She simply described how her world became smaller without her realizing it. How she stopped meeting friends because it upset him. How she stopped making financial decisions because he insisted he was better at it. How she slowly learned to ask permission for things she had once done without thinking. Halfway through her testimony, Ethan quietly lowered his head. It was the first time since his arrest that he stopped trying to make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. Then Marcus Hale took the stand. Unlike the emotional testimony that came before him, Marcus presented only procedure. Search warrants, digital forensic reports, cell phone records, laboratory analysis, security footage. He explained how every independent source confirmed the others without relying on assumptions or opinions. Finally, the prosecutor called me. Ethan's attorney smiled as I walked toward the witness stand. He believed my role as Laura's father would make me appear emotional and biased. His confidence disappeared before my first answer was finished. Instead of speaking about my daughter, I spoke about documentation. I explained why every unusual event had been recorded immediately instead of weeks later, why every photograph included a timestamp, why every threatening message had been preserved before being answered. Then I opened the notebook that had traveled with me every day since Laura came home. "When did you decide your son-in-law was guilty?" Ethan's attorney asked. I looked down at the first page before answering. "I didn't." He frowned. "Excuse me?" I closed the notebook and looked directly at the jury. I decided to record facts. The evidence decided everything else. The courtroom remained silent for several long seconds. Even the judge paused before motioning for the questioning to continue. Closing arguments lasted less than an hour. The prosecutor never asked the jury to dislike Ethan. He asked them to compare one thing only: the consistency of the evidence against the consistency of Ethan's explanations. One required no guessing. The other required ignoring almost every independent fact presented during the trial. Late that afternoon, the verdict was returned. Ethan Brooks was found guilty of stalking, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, filing a false police report, and multiple related offenses. As the clerk read each count aloud, Ethan remained perfectly still. There was no anger left on his face. No confidence. Only the realization that the image he had spent years constructing had been dismantled one documented fact at a time. As deputies prepared to escort him from the courtroom, Ethan looked toward Laura one final time. She didn't look away. She didn't cry. She simply stood beside me with quiet confidence. Months earlier, she had hidden inside a gas station restroom praying someone would rescue her. Now she stood in open court without fear because she no longer needed someone to speak for her. Watching her in that moment, I realized the verdict wasn't the greatest victory we had won that day. The greatest victory was that Ethan no longer had the power to decide how my daughter saw herself. And that was something no court could ever write into a judgment. Almost a year has passed since the night Laura arrived at my front door believing she had nowhere left to run. These days, she no longer checks over her shoulder every time a car slows near the house. She no longer silences her phone before going to sleep. The nightmares still visit from time to time, but they no longer decide how she lives the next morning. Healing, I've learned, doesn't happen the day justice is served. It happens on ordinary Tuesdays, when someone laughs without forcing it, walks into a grocery store without planning the nearest exit, or drives home without checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds. Laura rented a small house only 15 minutes away, close enough that we still shared Sunday dinners, yet far enough that every light she turned on belonged entirely to her. She returned to helping children find their voices through speech therapy, and little by little, she rediscovered her own. The first time I visited her new home, I noticed something that made me smile. Beside the front door hung a simple porch light, almost identical to the one Margaret insisted we leave on every night. Laura caught me looking at it and laughed softly. I guess I stole one of Mom's habits. I smiled back. Some habits are worth stealing. Henry still stopped by every Friday morning pretending he needed coffee more than conversation. Susan continued walking past the house every evening with her dog, always waving even when she knew I was watching from the porch. Doctor Melissa Grant occasionally called, just to tell me Laura had smiled through an entire workday without once looking over her shoulder. Even Rachel found the courage to rebuild parts of the life she had abandoned years earlier. She once told me that watching Laura refuse to surrender had finally convinced her to stop living as though Ethan still occupied every room she entered. Pain had brought strangers together, but truth had quietly turned them into something that felt very much like family. One afternoon, while cleaning the garage, Laura found the old metal evidence case I had carried through most of my career. She lifted it onto the workbench and asked, "Do you still keep everything?" I opened the lid. Inside were empty evidence bags, worn notebooks, a faded camera strap, and the yellow legal pad where Laura had written her very first sentence that morning at my kitchen table. She picked it up carefully and read the opening line aloud. The first time he checked my phone, he said it was because he worried about my safety. After a long silence, she closed the notebook and looked at me. If you hadn't asked me to write instead of just talk, I don't think I ever would have seen the pattern. I shook my head gently. The pattern was always there. You simply stopped blaming yourself long enough to see it. She reached across the workbench and hugged me, the same way she had as a little girl after scraping her knees on the sidewalk. Some moments don't erase the past. They simply remind you the past no longer owns you. Before she left that evening, Laura walked onto the porch and automatically switched on the porch light, even though the sun hadn't completely disappeared yet. "You still turn it on early," I said with a smile. She looked back at me. "Because I want anyone who needs a safe place to know this house isn't dark." After she drove away, I remained on the porch for a long time watching that warm light spread across the front steps. Margaret used to say a porch light wasn't meant to keep darkness away. It was meant to help people find their way home. I finally understood what she meant. That light had guided my daughter home on the worst night of her life, but it had also guided me. It reminded me that protecting someone doesn't always mean fighting for them. Sometimes it means believing them before the world does, standing beside them when they can't stand alone, and refusing to let fear write the ending of their story. If there's one lesson I hope you take from mine, it's this. Control often arrives wearing the mask of love, But real love never demands that you become smaller to keep someone else comfortable. Trust your instincts, protect your peace, and never be ashamed to ask for help before silence becomes your prison. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If Frank and Laura's story meant something to you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about family, courage, justice, and the quiet strength that changes lives, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep the light on for yourself and for someone who may one day need to find their way home.